One of the great challenges, and I find one of the blessings in having to prepare these last couple of years for these most unusual services for the High Holy Days, has been the freedom that it has provided us to move things around, to play with how we present things. And so for both of the evening services for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we actually took the rabbi's sermon out of the actual prayer service for the sake of time and presented it separately. An act of faith, if you will, that people would actually go and read it. But I know from the fact that people have responded to last year's and even to Rosh Hashanah's, that people are watching, are listening, and it's appreciated. And I hope you got a chance to see last night's words, because we will be referring back to them somewhat this morning. But I want to begin this morning's message with three quick stories, having nothing to do with Torah at all, to frame my message for this morning. Story number one, if you saw the picture above the fold of Monday's Washington Post Metro section, it carried a rather remarkable caption, and I'm quoting here. Residents move a casket across Richmond Highway on Thursday to demonstrate the possible traffic-related deaths from its expansion in Gum Springs, one of the oldest black suburban neighborhoods in the country. The community last called upon the casket in 1967. I have it on good authority, you'll be happy to know the casket was empty and merely for symbolic purposes. Story number two. When Lauren and I had the chance to visit Emily and Phil this summer, we stayed on the mainland, right off of Hilton Head Island, in a small town called Bluffton, where they now live. We saw the traffic on the bridge to Hilton Head every day. Emily explained that the town wants to expand the bridge, probably by building another one right next to it, sort of like we did in Maryland and Northern Virginia a number of years ago. Except that would require them to build on Gullah land, the land of the indigenous population, land that is now protected by law. And this is most likely because the original bridge was also built on and through Gullah land before those legal protections were put in place. And third is the story about those of you who have school children or school grandchildren in the Prince George's County Public Schools actually got the opportunity not to have them spend their first day of school on Rosh Hashanah this year. It was an unfortunate oversight when the draft calendars came out that the one calling for school opening after Labor Day originally suggested that the schools would open on Tuesday, the first day of Rosh Hashanah. It happened because there was nobody in the process of drafting that calendar, excuse me, looking at the calendar through Jewish eyes. It wasn't a deliberate attempt to harm or embarrass us as a community. It was an oversight based upon lack of experience. But it required a local rabbi or two to step forward, to advocate, there we go, to fight for what we should never have had to fight for. And in the end, we had to settle for what we could get. No more than we had in the past, probably a little less than we deserved under the circumstances. The connection between the first two stories seems obvious, but the inclusion of the third with it may seem like a stretch or a challenge to some for now. I hope it will not by the time we finish. In last night's sermon, I pointed out that part of what makes our lives more complicated and stressful these days is that the number of concentric circles in which we impactfully live our lives has increased, and the number of identities we carry that do not always or ever line up neatly for us has increased as well. So in a time when we are becoming more aware that what we do and how we do it impacts others, some of whom we may not even be able to see, we also have to recognize that our actions have the potential to reach even farther than ever before, and therefore carry more potential impact than ever before. Such is the power, but also the burden and the responsibility of living in a globalized society. A realization that seems appropriate for us to acknowledge on this day of atonement seeking as we stand before each other and God. Great, I hear you mumbling, even through the ether. As if teshuvah wasn't already challenging enough. Now this Meshuggah rabbi wants to make it even harder than we thought it was already? Well, sadly, yes. Just because a truth is inconvenient or difficult doesn't stop it from being true. I wish it did. I think back to the metaphor of the rock making ripples on the pond. The ripples do not stop when we cease to see them. We cease to see them before they stop because they become imperceptible to our eye. But those ripples, the impacts, the further away from us they get, are still felt even when we cannot see them. For some time now, we more religiously liberal Jews have embraced the value and importance of doing social action as part of the core of our Jewish identity. We even gave it a catchy Hebrew name, Tikkun Olam, the completion or perfection of God's creation, over which we were made caretakers at the time that Adam and Eve were formed, all for the glory of God's name, and because the people who we help really need our help, and for the good feelings we get from giving the help. As a congregation, we are incredibly fortunate to have an amazing social action committee here led by Nancy Feinberg, including both of those we called for aliyot this morning, that creates opportunities, even during the limitations of COVID, for us to do this kind of feel-good, do-good work. And we need to collectively see how we can do more to support their essential and valuable work. Get more involved so that we can have a greater collective impact in even more areas that can use our help. Because trust me, there are more areas than we can see. They continue to provide these opportunities even in new and creative ways, like still participating in our seasonal food drive, even when we are not face-to-face to hand out the bags on Rosh Hashanah, or return them filled with canned and dry goods to distribute to the food pantries in 3 counties throughout these holy days and on this Yom Kippur. As they, as a committee, continue to learn about the issues they are trying to influence for the better, I sense that they are starting to recognize what I learned as a Brickner Fellow of the Religious Action Center a couple of years ago. Namely, that this social action work is good and incredibly necessary and important. But all too often it feels like a Band-Aid applied to heal a visible symptom of a larger issue that requires a far more systemic and deeper cure. I was reminded of this truth last spring when Roni arranged for our religious school students to participate in an online seminar with Mazon, a Jewish response to hunger, an organization of which Temple Solel is a proud partner congregation. And if I may add, an excellent recipient along with our own Charlie Fund or direct contributions for those whose participation in that annual food drive will be made easier this year if it can be made financially for lack of the ability to shop and drop off bags of canned and boxed goods. It had been years since I had worked with Mazon. And in that time, they had redirected their energy and resources from direct support of local food programs towards education, policy development, and advocacy on a national level. They did this because they recognized that these were the efforts and levels at which they could make a real impact on the actual causes of food insecurity. And because they discovered they were spending way too much on metaphorical Band-Aids the other way in supporting local food pantries. Now, please hear me clearly. I continue to support our food drive and our local food pantries personally, and I ask you all to do the same. Because locally is where the people who need our help are, and our efforts can and do make a real difference for the good, especially while we are awaiting the greater impact of the larger social justice efforts. It's like a patient taking medication for a medical condition, but facing surgery for it. They don't stop taking those medications before surgery unless there's a separate issue with them. And so it is here. In our teshuvah seeking of this season, social action work is the evidence that we are doing something to help. But social justice work is attempting to right the injustices and restore the equity that an uneven system has created and maintained. On Maimonides' ladder of tzedakah, social action is clearly valued and absolutely a part. Social justice work just comes in at a higher level. Sometimes we can aspire to, sometimes we can even reach a higher rung on that ladder. Sometimes doing what we can has to be good enough. In an ideal program, as ours is becoming, both options are available to those who wish to get involved. And so in our first two stories, it would be easy to see both just the situation in Northern Virginia and in South Carolina as traffic issues. But it turns out that they are both far more than that. In both cases, when those who were tasked with fixing the traffic problem looked at the possible solutions to the traffic, widening the road was the logical answer. And in truth, it's usually most easily and inexpensively achieved on the same site, or as close to the original site as possible. But when the initial road or bridge was placed where it was because of a sense of NIMBY, the entitlement that cries out, "Not in my backyard, you don't," a conscious decision may have been made to move it to a place where the impact would be on someone other than us, especially if it fell instead on a group that we may already as a society have been in the habit of ignoring or undervaluing, even unconsciously. And when that happens, my friends, congratulations, we have reached the level of institutionalized injustice and racism. And then the real issue becomes restoring equity first, solving a traffic problem second. In South Carolina, there seems to be more awareness of this than is apparent in Gum Springs, Virginia, which is far more local to us, which is why they needed that coffin back in 1967. Or it could just be Emily's awareness and anticipation of having to fight against a proposal whose need she recognizes and from which she would benefit, because she also recognizes that it unjustly harms a protected group. And by the way, what floored me most about the Virginia protest was the fact that they had to use that coffin back in 1967 and are using it still now. Friends, when we can recognize these hidden issues of institutionalized prejudice, we can start to address them. And now perhaps the third story's connection becomes clearer. For it too is an example of a lack of the needs of a group of others being recognized in trying to solve an issue. In this case, we Jews are that other group. By Prince George's County Public Schools' own definitions, the first day of school should have been seen unavoidably as something that should not be scheduled on Rosh Hashanah, something unique in its existence that could not be made up for those that chose to opt out of school in favor of their religious ideology. But because no one was looking at the proposed calendars with a Jewish lens, because there were too many educational issues on the table at the same time, this truth was missed. And so we had to fight for ourselves. And as I noted earlier, we succeeded, but not completely. And that too is also a part of the story. We had to make the decision to settle for what we knew we could win, which was to avoid starting on Tuesday, when the truly equitable decision would have been either to wait for Thursday and not give off, but wait for Rosh Hashanah to be completely over before starting, or the even more educationally sound decision to start school a week or two earlier to help a little bit with last year's feared education lost, which would have made Rosh Hashanah just another day of instruction instead of needing to treat it as a separate case and close school because it was opening day. It would have allowed us to have Yom Kippur off instead of having to trade it for opening school a day later, which is always preferable because it's the more solemn day. Once it was clear that the decision makers couldn't even agree on what was best educationally, we took what we could get as Jews and we ran. Which makes this seem like a good moment for me to reintroduce Hillel's conundrum, because I think this example really makes clear how it usually plays out today and how it could or should. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? When a proposed school schedule fails to account for Rosh Hashanah, it is already clear that we have no allies on the inside to work for us and with us. And while I would have loved to have had non-Jewish colleagues by my side in making the case with us, it was easier and quicker, and thankfully I had the access to the right people to do it quietly by myself, and so I did. But from this, I learned, and I think we learn, that given the choice of which of Hillel's first two lines to emphasize, all other things being equal, including the order that Hillel spoke them in, line 2 would be my actual preference every time as a rabbi. If I am only for myself, what am I? Putting the emphasis there encourages relationship building and makes reaching out through the rippling concentric circles easier than if we put the emphasis on the first line about if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? And start to rebuild figurative walls around ourselves, ghetto-like, for self-protection. However, when all other things are not equal, as in this case, we need to be able and willing to embrace that first line completely. And that makes the if not now, when, not just the rhetorical device we usually see it as being, not just the spur to moving from philosophical debate to real-time action. It makes it actually the method for knowing which is essential. What is happening right now? What does this moment require of me or of us? And so to close, I want to put on the table arguably the biggest social action and social justice issue of our day: climate change, environmental justice. No other issue should be as clearly and universally important as making sure that the next generation can continue to live safely on this big blue marble that we all share. No other issue needs more of both our social action efforts on a personal level to increase awareness and reduce our individual footprints, along with a strong social justice approach to restore justice and equity to our much-needed efforts at systemic change. If not now on this one, when? And yet it is also true that for no other issue is there as big a difference of opinion as to how to balance between these absolute needs and the needs that are generally lumped together and called making progress as a society, which are real and legitimate. This conflict is not new. We actually see it in Genesis chapter 1, albeit hidden in a very small dot. God creates man and woman in the divine image. God blesses man and woman, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." The conflict comes in with the next word in Hebrew, usually written kiv shuha, have dominion over it or exert force over it. Except we need to remember that the dots, like the one that makes that letter a shin in kiv shuha, and makes us read the word this way, weren't added to the text until the 8th century CE far after we had a written text, far after we had an interpretation of that text. So while it's likely that the dot on the right-hand side, making it a shin, is correct based upon usage that had already existed, biblical commentators and scholars ask, what if this dot was added wrong when the dots were added? What if a forced choice was made and in the original there was actually no dot at all and it could be read either way? Because if you put the dot on the other side and make the letter a sin, kind of ironic on Yom Kippur that we're making it a sin, the word becomes kiv suha. And the commandment to us is to shepherd the world and creation, to take care of it, not to enforce our will upon it. A very different understanding of our responsibilities to that world around us. The debate between economic growth and sustaining what we already have on the one hand, and the environmental impact of those decisions on the other, is a very real one. Ideally, it would be resolved in a manner which has minimal negative impact on the environment in terms of use of limited resources and damage to non-renewable ones, and allows maximal ability to provide the resources needed for economic stability and growth. Ideally, scientific studies demonstrating the short and long-term impacts of our behaviors and of proposed alternatives would be utilized and respected. These must be among the goals of our policymakers. Taking into account the institutional inequities makes a difficult calculus even harder. These issues reach from decisions like building questionable oil pipelines through Native American lands, rather than working to reduce the risks of possible spills from those pipelines. In other words, shifting the problem of possible spills to others instead of taking it on ourselves, instead of resolving it. But they can also be something as simple as answering the proverbial question, who is the Lorax? Who speaks for the trees? You'll chuckle. The Lorax was fictitious the last time I looked. Who plays that role in real time? Which is why having social justice warriors fight the big systemic fights is essential. But so too is the personal groundwork. How can I reduce my footprint? How can the temple reduce ours? How can we help our various communities that we're part of to do more? Our Social Action Committee has been discussing this for a while now. They've got a number of good ideas, some of which they've started to put into place, some of which we'll hopefully be able to begin to see coming into place as we start to come into the building ourselves more and more as we move forward. They have a number of proposals prepared, small and large. There's even one about going solar here at the temple, which is on hold at the moment, not because we're not in a hurry to get it done, but thankfully because a significant behind-the-scenes effort may lead to legislation that will make it far easier, more economically viable for nonprofits like us to do exactly this. And I am grateful to Abby Snyder for being a partner in this work and for helping to get it to the point that it's at. If and when we get to a vote on this in Annapolis, which hopefully will happen in the upcoming session, we're going to need grassroots support to lobby for the bill. An example of social justice work and social action working hand in hand. And until then, what practical steps can we easily take that will improve our footprints in ways that a bigger change when it comes will accommodate? How will we reopen more fully when the time is right in ways that make us greener? What learning and teaching can we be doing now to make our decisions and efforts later easier, more effective, less divisive? That's the work that's going on now. In short, how can we show the same compassion when we deal with national or global issues like the environment as we do on the more intimate levels that come easier at this Teshuvah season on Yom Kippur? How can we own our share of the responsibility and seek to change for the better in the coming year in these more global areas and influence others who own significantly larger shares to do the same so real improvements can be achieved? How do we act compassionately towards our nation and our planet, making real the words spoken by earlier generations, whether those words were, "I love my country unconditionally, whether we are right or wrong," or "I love my country enough to hold us accountable when I fear we are wrong," or even, "It's not nice to fool Mother Nature," or its related, "Show Mother Nature your love." Friends, as we enter the year 5782, let these be among the questions we seek to answer. The ways that we show our compassion, our true teshuvah, our righteous tzedakah, tefillah that comes from our hearts and our souls. May this be how we earn our place in the book of life for another year. King Yehi Ratzon. May it be God's will. Amen.